I thought cruise ships were about freedom, until I realized they're perfect prisons where no one can hear you scream. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. I am 91 years old now, and I've learned that the most dangerous prisons aren't made of bars and concrete, but of endless water and floating steel. What I'm about to tell you are 3 cruise ship stories from my own life. 3 times I surrendered myself to the arms of the ocean, believing I would find peace. And 3 times I found myself trapped inside a terrifying ship. The first happened in October of 1979, when I was 46 years old and working as a high school English teacher in Portland, Oregon. My husband, Robert, had died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years earlier, and I was still learning how to exist in a world that felt unbearably quiet without him. I was going through a truly difficult time, but my sister Janet, who lived in San Diego, kept calling me, checking in, trying to support me however she could. She kept telling me that I needed a break. "Margaret, you've been a widow long enough," she said one Sunday evening over the phone. "Come on this cruise with me, 7 days to Mexico. Sun, margaritas, and 0 responsibilities. When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" I thought about it and froze. Had I done anything just for myself since losing Robert? I couldn't remember. So I booked an interior cabin on the SS Pacific Dream, which was set to depart from Los Angeles on October the 14th. Interior cabins were cheaper, and on a teacher's salary, money was tight. Not having a window didn't bother me. I assumed I'd spend most of my time on deck anyway, reading and watching the ocean. The ship wasn't luxurious like the modern mega cruise liners you see today. It carried maybe 900 passengers, and everything felt a little worn down. The carpets were faded from years of foot traffic. The dining room chairs wobbled at the legs, and the corridors smelled faintly of industrial cleaner mixed with salt water. But I didn't want to ruin my mood by focusing on small things. My cabin was on deck 4, number 4172. A narrow rectangle with 2 single beds bolted to the floor. A tiny bathroom where the shower sprayed directly onto the toilet, and walls thin enough that I could hear my neighbors breathing. To my left, in cabin 4170, was a retired couple from Sacramento who constantly argued in cheerful voices about which shore excursions to book. To my right, in cabin 417 more, there was silence. For the first 2 days, I neither saw nor heard anyone staying there. The door remained closed. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no sound of a television or a running shower, just an unsettling, heavy silence, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't dwell on it. After all, I was here to distract myself and spend time with my sister. Janet and I spent those first days exploring the ship, playing shuffleboard, and sitting through a terrible magic show where the magician kept dropping his props. We ate far too much at the buffet and laughed at almost nothing in particular, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves they're having fun. But at night, alone in my cabin, I'd lie awake listening to that silence next door. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear something else. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across the wall, or a low rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Would you have ignored the sounds next door, or asked for a different cabin? Tell me what you would have done. On the third night, around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, broken sobs coming through the wall beside my bed. A woman's voice, raw with grief, repeating something over and over in a language I didn't recognize. I sat up, heart pounding. The crying continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly, replaced by that heavy silence again. The next morning, I mentioned it to Janet over breakfast. Do you know who's staying in the cabin next to mine? I keep hearing strange sounds. She shrugged. Probably just newlyweds. You know how thin these walls are. But it hadn't sounded like passion. It had sounded like mourning. That afternoon, while Janet was at a wine tasting, I returned to my cabin to grab a sweater. As I approached my door, I noticed the cabin next to mine, 4174, was open. Not wide open, just cracked a few inches, as if someone had stepped out briefly. I know I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity pulled me forward like a fishhook. I knocked softly. Hello? Anyone there? No answer. I pushed the door open a few more inches and peered inside. The cabin was identical to mine in layout, but something about it felt wrong. The air was cold, impossibly cold, like standing in front of an open freezer. And the smell, sharp and chemical, like hospital disinfectant mixed with something organic and rotting. The beds were made with military precision. White sheets pulled so tight they looked painted on. On the small desk sat a suitcase, closed, and on the wall beside the bed, someone had scratched words into the paint with something sharp. She's still here. My blood turned to ice. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps in the corridor. I jerked back, pulling the door almost closed, and hurried into my own cabin. Through my peephole, I watched as a crew member, a young man in a white steward's uniform, approached cabin 174, glanced up and down the hallway, then entered quickly, shutting the door behind him. I pressed my ear against the wall. Muffled voices. Two men, speaking in urgent, clipped tones. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. They were arguing about something. Then silence. 30 seconds later, the door opened and closed. Footsteps retreated down the corridor. That evening at dinner, I asked our waiter, a friendly Filipino man named Carlos, about cabin 4174. His smile faltered for just a moment. "Why do you ask?" "I'm in the cabin next door. I've been hearing strange sounds, and today I saw—" "You should not worry about other passengers," Carlos interrupted gently but firmly. "Sometimes people travel for difficult reasons. Privacy is important, yes?" "Carlos, I saw something written on the wall." He set down the water pitcher he'd been holding and leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Ms. Margaret, please, do not ask questions about that cabin. It is, how do I say, complicated. For your own peace, enjoy your cruise and do not worry about what you hear at night." The way he said, "What you hear at night," made my skin crawl. He knew. Whatever was happening in cabin 4174, the crew knew about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. The hum of the ship's engines, the distant laughter from the deck above, the periodic creaks and groans of metal expanding and contracting. Around 1 a.m., the crying started again. Louder this time, more desperate. The woman's voice sobbed and wailed, and I could hear her pounding on something. The wall, the door, I couldn't tell. Then suddenly, a man's voice, low and harsh, speaking rapid Spanish. The woman screamed. Something heavy hit the wall between our cabins so hard that a picture frame fell off my wall and shattered on the floor. I grabbed the phone and called the front desk. "This is cabin 4172. There's a disturbance in the cabin next to mine. I think someone's being hurt." "We are aware of the situation, Ms. Margaret," the operator said calmly. Too calmly. "Security is handling it. Please remain in your cabin." "But someone's screaming." "Please remain in your cabin. Thank you." The line went dead. I sat frozen on my bed, listening. The crying had stopped again, replaced by that terrible silence. 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps in the corridor, multiple people, moving quickly. Voices speaking in low, urgent tones. A door opening and closing. Then silence again. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, exhausted and rattled, I went straight to the purser's office. The assistant purser, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Diane, listened patiently as I explained what I'd heard. "Ms. Margaret, I understand your concern," she said carefully, "but I need to assure you that there is no danger to you or any other passenger. The situation you're describing is sensitive. I can't give you details, but I can tell you that everything is being handled appropriately." "What does that mean? Is someone being held against their will?" Diane's expression softened. "No, nothing like that. The passenger in cabin 4174 is traveling under special circumstances, and we have crew monitoring the situation. That's all I can tell you. Then move me to a different cabin. We're fully booked. I'm sorry. For the next 2 days, I barely stayed in my cabin. I spent my time on deck, in the library, anywhere but that narrow corridor on deck 4. Janet thought I was being paranoid, enjoying the sun and the buffet too much to understand why I looked exhausted and jumped at sudden sounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening just a few feet away, separated from me only by a thin wall and the cruise line's insistence on discretion. On the 6th night, our last night at sea, before returning to Los Angeles, I woke to find my cabin door unlocked. I always locked it, always. But now it stood slightly ajar, the corridor light spilling into my dark cabin in a thin yellow line. My heart hammered as I got up and peered into the hallway. Empty. But cabin 4174's door was open too. Wide open this time. And from inside came that chemical smell again. Stronger now, mixing with something else, something copper and wrong. I should have gone back into my cabin and locked the door, should have called security. But something pulled me forward. The cabin was empty. The beds still made with those impossibly tight sheets. The suitcase still on the desk, closed. But the walls were covered in scratches now, dozens of them carved deep into the paint. Words in English, Spanish, and languages I didn't recognize. Names, dates, prayers, and one phrase repeated over and over in shaky letters. She died here. She died here. She died here. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. That's when I saw her. A woman stood in the bathroom doorway, middle-aged, thin, wearing a simple black dress. Her face was gray, her eyes ringed with dark circles, so deep they looked like bruises. She stared at me with an expression I'll never forget. Not anger, not fear, just infinite, crushing sadness. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and that's when I noticed her wrists. Deep red marks circled them, like rope burns or restraints. I ran, stumbled back into my cabin, slammed the door, and shoved the chair under the handle. I sat on my bed, shaking, until dawn broke, and I heard the sounds of the ship waking up around me. I never told Janet what I saw. When we disembarked in Los Angeles the next morning, I looked back at the Pacific Dream one last time. On deck 4, I could see the corridor windows, and in one of them, just for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching the passengers leave. Years later, I tried to research Cabin 4174 on the SS Pacific Dream. I found only one reference, a brief mention in a maritime incident report from 1977. A passenger had died in that cabin, a woman traveling alone from Mexico. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but her family claimed she'd been trying to escape an abusive marriage and that someone had followed her onto the ship. The cruise line settled quietly with the family. The cabin was never used for regular passengers again after that, though the ship continued to sail for another decade. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that some cabins on some ships hold more than just temporary guests. They hold echoes of fear, of violence, of women who tried to escape and found only more walls. This was only the first time the sea trapped me. Subscribe if you want to hear what happened on the next ship. I was 58 years old when I learned for the second time that passenger ships can turn into floating prisons. By then, I should have known better than to ever book another cruise. But 12 years had passed since that night on Deck 4, and I had convinced myself that what I experienced had been an isolated incident, a horrific coincidence that couldn't possibly happen twice. I was wrong. It was January of 1991, and I was traveling from Portland with my book club, a group of 6 women who met every Tuesday to discuss literature and drink wine. We were a tight-knit, loud, laughing pack of middle-aged women. To celebrate our 10th anniversary, we decided on a Caribbean cruise aboard the Royal Empress, a mid-sized ship carrying around 1,400 passengers. Being surrounded by more people made me feel safer. We boarded the ship in Fort Lauderdale on a bright Saturday morning. The air smelled of diesel fuel and sunscreen, and a calypso band on the pier played Day-O while we waited to board. Everything felt festive, normal, pleasant. Our group had adjoining cabins on Deck 7. I was sharing mine with Linda, a retired nurse who had brought enough medication to stock a small pharmacy. As she lined up bottles of Dramamine, Imodium, and antibiotics in the tiny bathroom cabinet, she said, "You never know what you'll need." I laughed a little and agreed with her. After all, we were traveling by ship. The first 2 days were perfect. On Monday, we arrived in Grand Cayman, swam with stingrays, and ate fried conch at a beachside restaurant. On Tuesday, we were supposed to dock in Cozumel, but the captain announced a slight delay due to weather conditions. It was nothing serious, just a temporary tropical storm. That afternoon, I noticed something strange in the dining room. Several passengers were missing from their usual tables. Those who did show up looked pale, picking at their food. One man, a large businessman who had been loud and cheerful the day before, excused himself halfway through his meal and rushed toward the restroom, his face tinged green. "Motion sickness," Linda said confidently. "The ship's rocking more today because of the storm." She might have been right, but it didn't feel like ordinary seasickness to me. By dinner time, the main dining room was only half full. Crew members moved at an unusual speed, wiping down tables with disinfectant. The cheerful background music played so loudly it felt forced, as if trying to drown out the absence of diners. That night, around 10 p.m., a crackling announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your ship's manager. We are currently experiencing a minor gastrointestinal illness affecting a small number of passengers. As a precaution, we ask that anyone experiencing symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, or fever contact the medical center immediately. We are also implementing enhanced sanitation procedures throughout the ship. We apologize for the inconvenience." Linda and I exchanged worried glances. Minor outbreak on a cruise ship usually meant it wasn't minor at all. "Probably norovirus," Linda said. "Spreads like wildfire in closed environments. As long as we wash our hands constantly and avoid touching our faces, we should be fine." But the next morning, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The buffet on Lido deck was closed. Signs posted on the doors read, "Dining room service only. All food must be served by crew members. Do not serve yourself." Security guards stood at each entrance, ensuring compliance. In the corridors, crew members in masks and gloves wheeled carts of cleaning supplies. The smell of bleach was overwhelming, burning my nostrils and making my eyes water. Passengers shuffled past each other without making eye contact. Everyone suddenly aware that the person beside them might be contagious. By noon, Linda started feeling sick. "It's just a headache," she insisted, pressing her fingertips against her temples. "I'm probably dehydrated." An hour later, she was vomiting violently into the toilet while I held her hair back. Her skin felt like fire under my palm. When I called the medical center, the line was busy. I called again and again. On the fourth try, a harried-voiced nurse answered and told me to bring Linda down immediately. The medical center on Deck 2 looked like a war zone. Passengers filled every chair in the waiting area, some hunched over plastic bags, others lying on the floor, too weak to sit up. A child wailed while his mother tried to comfort him, her own face gray with illness. The smell, a nauseating combination of vomit, disinfectant, and human sweat, nearly made me gag. A crew member in full protective gear, gloves, mask, face shield, gown, approached me. Symptoms: my cabin mate, high fever, vomiting. Can barely stand. He pointed toward a curtained-off area. "Take her there. Someone will see her as soon as possible." I helped Linda onto a gurney. She looked terrible, her lips cracked on, her eyes sunken. "Margaret," she whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Don't let them keep me here. Please. You need medical attention. Promise me." But before I could answer, a doctor appeared, a young woman with exhausted eyes visible above her surgical mask. She examined Linda quickly, checked her vitals, and made notes on a clipboard. Severe dehydration, possible norovirus. she said, her voice muffled by the mask. We need to start IV fluids immediately. And you, she turned to me. When did your symptoms start? I don't have any symptoms. Not yet. But if you've been sharing a cabin, you've been exposed. We're setting up a quarantine section on deck 3. Anyone who's had close contact with infected passengers needs to isolate there. Quarantine? For how long? Until we're sure you're not incubating the illness. 72 hours minimum. I can't just... I'm not sick. I feel fine. The doctor's eyes hardened. Ma'am, we have over 200 confirmed cases and climbing. This ship is a closed system. If we don't contain the spread now, everyone on board will be sick by tomorrow. You can cooperate voluntarily, or security will escort you. Your choice. I chose to cooperate. Deck 3 had been transformed into makeshift isolation wards. Cabins that usually housed crew members now held clusters of exposed passengers, 3 or 4 to a room. They'd removed most of the furniture to make space for cots and provided us with basic supplies: water bottles, saltine crackers, hand sanitizer, and a bucket in case we started vomiting. I was placed in a cabin with 2 other women. Maria, a school teacher from Ohio, who had been traveling with her infected husband, and Ruth, an elderly woman who'd shared a dinner table with a sick couple. We introduced ourselves awkwardly, each of us secretly scanning the others for signs of illness. The first night was the longest of my life. The ship, which had felt so vast and open before, now felt suffocating. Our cabin had one small porthole, and through it I could see only black water and darker sky. The door was locked from the outside. A crew member in protective gear delivered meals 3 times a day, sliding trays through a slot like we were prisoners. Every hour, a nurse came by to check our temperatures and ask about symptoms. Maria developed a fever around midnight. By dawn, she was vomiting into the bucket, while Ruth and I pressed ourselves against the opposite wall, terrified. "I'm sorry," Maria gasped between heaves. "I'm so sorry." They took her away at 7 a.m., wheeling her out on a gurney, while Ruth and I stood silent, knowing our exposure risk had just increased exponentially. That afternoon, Ruth started showing symptoms. I was alone by evening, alone in that tiny cabin with a locked door and a bucket that reeked of bleach. Alone with my racing thoughts and the constant fear that every stomach twinge was the beginning of the end. Alone while the ship rocked and creaked around me, a floating petri dish carrying over 1,000 people through international waters. I later learned that the Royal Empress had been denied port entry at Cozumel. The Mexican authorities, hearing about the outbreak, refused to let us dock. We diverted to Jamaica, rejected again. The Bahamas, same response. No country wanted to risk an epidemic spreading to their shores. For 4 days, we drifted in the Caribbean, a ghost ship full of the sick and the terrified. If you were trapped on that ship, what would scare you more? The sickness or not being allowed to leave? The cruise line tried to maintain normalcy in the sections of the ship that remained unaffected. They ran movies, held bingo games with masks required, even attempted a poolside barbecue for the healthy passengers. But everyone knew we were trapped. I never got sick. On the fifth day, after my temperature had remained normal for 72 hours, they released me from quarantine. I walked out of that cabin on shaking legs, blinking in the bright corridor light like a prisoner seeing the sun after years underground. Linda had recovered and was back in our original cabin, weak but alive. 14 passengers hadn't been so lucky. Elderly people, mostly, whose bodies couldn't handle the dehydration and stress. They died quietly in the medical center, while the rest of us danced to steel drums on the deck above. The cruise line eventually negotiated emergency docking in San Juan, where ambulances waited to transport the sickest passengers to local hospitals. The rest of us were bused to the airport and flown home, our vacation cut short by 5 days. I never got a refund. I never got an apology, just a voucher for a future cruise, which I immediately threw away. The newspapers called it the Royal Empress Incident. Health investigators determined the norovirus had been brought aboard by a passenger who'd been sick before boarding, but had hidden his symptoms to avoid missing his vacation. One careless person and over 300 people paid the price. I'm 91 years old now, and I can still smell that bleach, can still feel the panic of being locked in a room while sickness spread through the ship like smoke through air, can still see Maria's apologetic face as she vomited into that bucket, knowing she was infecting us and unable to stop it. People think cruise ships are about freedom, endless ocean, new ports, escape from routine. But I learned they're the opposite. They're floating cages where you trust your life to recycled air and the hygiene habits of strangers, where a single sick person can doom everyone, where the ocean that seems so beautiful from the deck becomes a moat, keeping you trapped. If this story made you rethink cruises, leave a like so more people hear it. After the second incident, I told myself I would never set foot on a passenger ship again. Unfortunately, when I made the mistake of boarding a cruise ship for the third time, I was 70 years old and should have known better. But my granddaughter Emily was getting married, and the wedding was to take place on a 7-day Mediterranean cruise departing from Barcelona. Even though my instincts screamed at me to stay home, a sense of family obligation pulled me onto that ship. The ship was called Ocean Majesty, one of those massive floating resorts carrying 3,000 passengers and offering everything from rock climbing walls to ice skating rinks. Emily had chosen it because it would stop in Santorini, where she and her fiancé would exchange vows at sunset against the backdrop of white cliffs. It sounded like a beautiful plan. I boarded the ship on a Sunday in late September, carrying a bag full of books I hoped would distract me from the fear of being trapped at sea again. My cabin was on deck 9, a small room with a balcony, more expensive than I wanted to pay, but cheaper than sharing an interior cabin with a stranger. The first 3 days passed without incident. We sailed from Barcelona to Naples, where I toured Pompeii with the other older passengers, shuffling slowly through the ruins while our guide shouted facts about volcanic ash. In Rome, I tossed a coin into the Trevi fountain and ate gelato that tasted like sweetened chalk. Emily was radiant, constantly surrounded by her bridesmaids, and she barely noticed that her grandmother spent most of her time alone on her balcony, watching the Mediterranean drift by like a blue dream. On the 4th morning, as we sailed toward Santorini, I woke to the sound of sirens. Not the ship's alarm, something else. Security radios crackling in the corridor outside my cabin. Heavy footsteps running past my door. Urgent voices speaking in multiple languages. I opened my door to find organized chaos. Crew members in uniform were knocking on every cabin, checking IDs, asking questions. A security officer, a broad-shouldered Italian man with a grim expression, stopped at my door. "Passport, please." I handed it to him. He examined my photo, glanced at me, made a note on his tablet. "Did you leave your cabin last night, between midnight and 4 a.m.? "No, I was asleep. What's going on?" "There has been an incident. We are conducting a routine check. Please remain in your cabin until further notice." What kind of incident? But he'd already moved to the next door. I turned on the television, flipping through channels until I found the ship's information station. The usual cheerful announcements about spa specials and trivia contests had been replaced by a simple message. Due to an ongoing security matter, all passengers are asked to remain in their cabins until 10 a.m. Thank you for your cooperation. I called Emily's cabin. No answer. Tried my son Daniel, who was traveling with his wife. Straight to voicemail. At 9:47 a.m., my phone rang. It was the ship's security office, asking me to come to Deck 3 immediately for questioning. The security office was located in a windowless corridor near the crew quarters. 2 officers, 1 Italian, 1 British, sat across from me in a small interview room with walls the color of concrete. A camera blinked red in the corner. "Ms. Margaret Wilson," the British officer began, consulting notes on his laptop. "You're traveling alone, cabin 9042, correct?" "Yes. What is this about?" "We're interviewing all passengers on Deck 9. There was a death on your deck last night. We're trying to establish a timeline." The air left my lungs. "A death? Who?" "A passenger. We can't release details yet. But we need to ask, did you see or hear anything unusual between midnight and 4 a.m.? I thought back. I'd gone to bed around 11 after reading, had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from the Rome excursion. But now that they mentioned it, I might have heard something around 2 a.m., maybe later. I woke up for a moment and heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. It was brief. I thought someone was just rearranging their cabin. The officers exchanged glances. Which direction did the sound come from? I'm not sure. Maybe from above or next door. The cabins on cruise ships all blend together, sound traveling in strange ways through metal walls and floors. Did you hear voices, shouting, anything that suggested distress? No, just that dragging sound. Maybe 30 seconds, then silence. They asked more questions. Where I'd been during the day, who I'd interacted with, whether I'd noticed anyone acting strangely. I answered honestly, feeling increasingly unsettled. Finally, they thanked me and said I was free to go, but should remain available for follow-up questions. As I stood to leave, I asked, "How did this person die?" The British officer hesitated, then said, "We're treating it as suspicious." That's all we can say. Suspicious. Not natural causes. Not an accident. Suspicious. I found Emily in the buffet, surrounded by her bridesmaids, all of them whispering urgently. When she saw me, she rushed over. "Grandma, did you hear? Someone was murdered." "Murdered? How do you know?" "Everyone's talking about it. A woman from Texas. Her husband found her this morning in their cabin. Someone had—" Emily lowered her voice. "Strangled her with the bathrobe belt." My blood ran cold. "Which cabin?" "I don't know. Somewhere on deck 9. Deck 9. My deck? The rest of the day had an unreal quality. The ship continued toward Santorini, the crew maintaining their professional smiles while security officers moved through the crowds like sharks. Passengers gathered in clusters, trading rumors. Some said the husband did it. Others claimed it was a crew member with access to cabin keys. A few whispered about a serial killer, referencing unsolved murders on other cruise ships in recent years. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the corridor made me jump. Every creak of the ship settling felt like footsteps approaching my door. I checked the lock 17 times, wedged a chair under the handle, and kept my phone charged and ready to call for help. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, that dragging sound, heavier this time, deliberate, coming from the cabin next to mine. At this point, would you have stayed in your cabin or demanded to leave the ship? I pressed my ear against the wall. Silence. Then a soft thump. Then nothing. My cabin was 9042. The cabin to my left was 9040. To my right, 9044. I couldn't remember seeing anyone enter or leave either cabin during the entire cruise. In the morning, I went to the front desk and asked about the cabins adjacent to mine. The clerk typed on her computer, frowned, typed again. "Ma'am, cabin 9040 is unoccupied this voyage. cabin 9044, is registered to a Mr. James Torrance, traveling alone. Has Mr. Torrance been seen around the ship? She gave me a strange look. I couldn't tell you that, ma'am. Is there a problem? I've been hearing sounds from one of those cabins at night. If 9040 is empty, then it must be coming from 9044. But I've never seen anyone go in or out. Perhaps Mr. Torrance keeps irregular hours. Many guests do. But something about her expression told me she didn't believe her own explanation. That afternoon, while most passengers were ashore in Santorini for Emily's wedding, I stayed on the ship, told everyone I wasn't feeling well, needed to rest. In reality, I wanted to see if I could catch a glimpse of whoever was in cabin 9044. I sat on my balcony with a book, pretending to read while watching the cabin next door through the partial divider between balconies. The curtains were drawn. No movement, no sound. Hours passed. The sun began to set, painting the white cliffs of Santorini gold and pink. I could see the wedding party gathered on a terrace in the distance, tiny figures against the vast sky. Part of me regretted missing it, but a larger part needed to know what was happening next door. As twilight deepened, the balcony door of cabin 9044 opened. A man stepped out, tall, maybe 50, with dark hair graying at the temples. He wore casual clothes, jeans, a polo shirt, and held a glass of red wine. He stood at the railing, sipping slowly, his face expressionless. Nothing about him seemed dangerous, just a middle-aged man enjoying the view. But then he turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were wrong, empty in a way I'd only seen once before, decades ago. In the eyes of a student who'd later been convicted of killing his parents. No emotion, no recognition of another human being. Just cold assessment. Beautiful evening, he said, his voice pleasant and utterly dead. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. He smiled, a terrible, mechanical smile that didn't reach those empty eyes. You've been listening, haven't you? Through the walls, wondering what you're hearing. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. You're curious. That's good. Curiosity means you're still alive. He took another sip of wine. The woman in 9038, she was curious too. Knocked on my door at 1 a.m., complaining about noise. Said she'd call security if I didn't quiet down. The cabin where the murder happened. I invited her in to discuss it, he continued, his tone conversational. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. She was very insistent, very rude, actually. So I helped her be quiet, permanently. I was going to die. This man had just confessed to murder, and I was alone on a balcony with him, separated only by a thin divider I could never climb over fast enough. You're wondering why I'm telling you this, he said. It's simple. Tomorrow morning, we dock in Athens. I'll walk off the ship with 3,000 other passengers, and no one will stop me. The security footage from the corridors is grainy. They have no physical evidence. Her husband's the prime suspect now. He always is. And you're just a 70-year-old woman who heard some furniture moving. Who would believe you? He finished his wine and set the glass down on the balcony table with a soft clink. Enjoy the rest of your cruise, Margaret. Try to sleep better tonight. He went back inside and closed the door. I sat frozen, my mind racing. He knew my name. How did he know my name? Had he been watching me? Planning? I called security immediately, told them everything. They took my statement, said they'd investigate. 2 officers went to cabin 9044, found it empty. No James Torrance, no luggage, no evidence anyone had stayed there at all. The cabin was booked under that name, the British officer told me hours later, but paid for with a prepaid credit card and a fake passport. Whoever he was, he's either still on this ship or he's very good at hiding. They searched for 2 days, increased security at the Athens disembarkation, checked every passenger against their documentation, found nothing. The man from cabin 9044 simply vanished. The Texas woman's husband was arrested when we reached Athens, charged with her murder. The last I heard, he was still in a Greek prison, maintaining his innocence. I know the truth, but truth without proof is just another story no one believes. Emily's wedding photos are beautiful. White dress against white cliffs, sunset over the Aegean, joy captured in pixels. She never knew what happened while she was saying her vows. I never told her. Why ruin her memory with my nightmare? But I know, and that's why, at 91 years old, I will never board another cruise ship. Not for weddings, not for reunions, not for any reason. Because I learned that cruise ships aren't just floating hotels. They're perfect hunting grounds for people who understand that once you're at sea, you're beyond normal laws, normal protections. You're in international waters, where jurisdiction is murky and justice moves slow. Where a man can kill someone in cabin 9038, confess to his neighbor in 9042, and walk off the ship in Athens while someone else takes the blame. If you want to hear more true horror stories that happened to me, and the ones I barely survived, subscribe and stay with me.